Every story has a moment that changes everything. And today, we're about to discover it. The room was filled with power. Washington, D.C. had gathered under one roof. Political leaders, major donors, national journalists, community advocates, business executives. People whose opinions carried weight. People whose decisions shaped careers. People who were used to being noticed the moment they entered a room. Tonight, however, every eye was focused on one man, Eric Thompson. He sat near the front of the ballroom wearing a confident smile that had taken years to build. Years of interviews, years of public appearances, years of speeches, years of hearing people praise his leadership. The massive screen behind the stage displayed photographs from educational programs across Washington, scholarship celebrations, community outreach events, students smiling beside mentors, images that represented success. At least that was how it appeared. The master of ceremonies stepped toward the microphone. The crowd settled. A few conversations faded. Several cameras shifted toward the stage. The moment everyone had been waiting for was finally here. Ladies and gentlemen, we now arrive at our final recognition of the evening. Applause echoed through the ballroom. Eric adjusted his jacket, a practiced movement, calm, controlled, certain, because he already knew what was coming. The National Community Impact Leadership Award, one of the highest honors in the nonprofit world. The award that would place his name among some of the most respected leaders in the country. For years he had imagined this night. The applause, the photographs, the standing ovation, the speech, everything. A few tables away, guests were already smiling toward him. Some nodded in congratulations. Others quietly raised their glasses. The outcome felt inevitable. Eric glanced toward the stage and allowed himself a small smile. Victory was only minutes away. Then something unusual happened. Not on the stage, not on the screen. Near the ballroom entrance, the large doors opened. Quietly, almost unnoticed, a man stepped inside carrying a leather portfolio. No cameras followed him, no one announced him, no one rushed over to greet him. Most of the room never even turned their heads. Why would they? He looked like another professional attending another event in Washington. Nothing more, nothing less. The man moved carefully between tables, his expression calm, his posture confident, his attention fixed on the stage. Nobody paid attention. Nobody except one person. Aaliyah Carter. From her seat near the back of the ballroom, she noticed him immediately. At first, she wasn't sure why. Something about him felt familiar. The way he walked, the way he carried himself, the way he seemed completely unaffected by the importance of the room around him. Aaliyah sat forward slightly. Her eyes followed him. For a brief moment, she forgot about the award ceremony entirely, forgot about Eric, forgot about the tension she had been carrying for months, because suddenly her attention belonged to the stranger. Then the man turned his head, just enough. Aaliyah saw his face, and her heart nearly stopped. No. It couldn't be. Not here. Not tonight. Not after all these years. The stranger continued walking. Aaliyah stared, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Trying to understand why he would be here. Trying to understand what this could possibly mean. Across the room, Eric remained focused on the stage, completely unaware. The audience remained relaxed, completely unaware. The ceremony continued, completely unaware. But Aaliyah knew something had changed. She just didn't know what. And sometimes the most important moments arrive so quietly that nobody realizes history has entered the room. Until it's too late. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone else receive credit for something you helped build? Have you ever stayed silent while someone else collected the applause? If you have, tell us in the comments below. Your story may inspire someone who needs it today, and if you believe integrity still matters, take a second to like this video because it helps YouTube share stories like this with more people. Stay with me, because what happened inside that ballroom changed every life in that room. Welcome to Mr. Obama Stories, where stories don't just get told, they come alive. This is the home of powerful American stories, stories of struggle, success, mystery, history, and the unforgettable moments that shaped people, communities, and dreams. From inspiring life journeys to shocking real events, every story here is crafted to make you think, feel, and see the world differently. At Mr. Obama Stories, we believe every voice matters and every story carries a lesson. Whether it's motivation, history, real-life drama, or untold experiences, you'll always leave with something unforgettable. So sit back, relax, and let the story begin. Because here, every story has a meaning, and every meaning has a story. Subscribe and become part of the journey. Now, the audience still believed they were about to witness Eric Thompson's greatest triumph. They had no idea they were seconds away from witnessing something far more powerful. The master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. The room grew quiet again. Eric straightened in his chair. Ready, prepared, certain. Then the host said something nobody expected. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we present tonight's award, we have one additional guest speaker." A few people exchanged confused looks. Eric frowned slightly. That wasn't listed in the program. The host continued. "Our next presenter recently completed an independent review involving several educational initiatives connected to this organization." A ripple of curiosity moved through the room. Eric's smile weakened, only slightly, but Aaliyah noticed. The stranger carrying the portfolio stood. The ballroom watched as he walked toward the stage. Measured, calm, unhurried. He reached the podium, opened the portfolio, removed several documents, then looked directly at the audience. The room became completely silent, and the first words he spoke changed everything. "A great deal of credit has been given to the wrong person." The ballroom froze. Eric stopped smiling. Aaliyah stopped breathing. The stranger lowered his eyes toward the documents, then looked up again, and spoke a name nobody expected to hear. Aaliyah Carter. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even reached for a glass, because suddenly the biggest award of the night no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was the truth. And the truth had finally arrived, years before the award ceremony, years before the divorce, years before anyone questioned who deserved credit. Washington, D.C. looked very different to Aaliyah Carter, not because the city had changed, because her focus was somewhere entirely different. Most people spent their mornings chasing opportunities. Aaliyah spent hers creating them. The Southeast Washington Community Center wasn't impressive from the outside. The brick walls showed their age. The parking lot needed repairs. The basketball court carried faded paint from years of use. Yet every afternoon the building came alive. Teenagers filled the hallways. Laughter bounced between classrooms. Music drifted from open doors. Arguments started and ended within minutes. It wasn't perfect, but it mattered, and Aaliyah loved it. On that particular afternoon, nearly 30 teenagers occupied one of the larger meeting rooms. Some leaned back in their chairs. Some stared at their phones. A few looked completely uninterested. One boy sat with his hood pulled low. Another tapped his pencil against the table repeatedly. The energy in the room felt restless, the kind of energy that could become chaos if handled poorly. Aaliyah sat in a chair among them rather than standing at the front. No podium, no microphone, no presentation slides, just a notebook resting on her lap. A teenager near the back raised his hand. Actually, raised wasn't the right word. He lifted it halfway, like he wasn't fully committed. What if school just isn't for everybody? Several students nodded. Aaliyah looked at him. "What makes you ask that?" The teenager shrugged. "Because some people work hard and still don't get anywhere." A few others agreed. The conversation immediately became louder. Everyone suddenly had something to say. Aaliyah listened, really listened. She didn't rush to correct anyone. She didn't lecture. She didn't pretend to have all the answers. One student talked about family problems. Another talked about feeling ignored. A third complained about teachers. Aaliyah allowed them to speak, allowed them to feel heard. Sometimes that mattered more than advice. Near the doorway, someone new entered the room. Eric Thompson. He carried a folder under one arm. His original plan was simple. Meet with the center's director. Discuss a possible nonprofit partnership. Review a proposal. Leave. Nothing complicated. Then he heard the discussion, and stopped. The meeting room wasn't quiet. Far from it. Teenagers interrupted each other constantly. Some disagreed, some joked, some challenged every point. Yet somehow Aaliyah kept the room together, without controlling it, without demanding attention, without making herself the center of the conversation. Eric found himself watching. The students weren't listening because they had to. They were listening because they wanted to. That difference caught his attention immediately. A boy near the front folded his arms. "Nobody really cares what happens to us anyway." Several students fell quiet. The comment carried more weight than the speaker probably intended. Aaliyah looked at him carefully, then asked a simple question. "Do you believe that?" The boy hesitated, just for a second. Sometimes. The room became quieter. Aaliyah nodded slowly. "Thank you for being honest." No speech followed, no dramatic response, just respect. The boy looked surprised, almost as if he expected an argument. Instead, he got understanding. Eric noticed that too. Something about the exchange stayed with him. The discussion continued for another 40 minutes. By the end, the atmosphere had changed completely. Students who arrived withdrawn were participating. Students who arrived frustrated were laughing. Students who barely spoke were contributing. Aaliyah hadn't forced any of it. She simply created space for it to happen. When the session finally ended, chairs scraped against the floor. Backpacks were collected. Teenagers poured into the hallway. Several stopped to thank Aaliyah before leaving. One waved. Another promised to finish an assignment. A third reminded her about an upcoming basketball game. The interactions felt natural, like family, not obligation. As the room emptied, Aaliyah closed her notebook. Then she noticed someone standing near the doorway. Eric. Their eyes met. For a brief second, neither spoke. Eric recovered first. "You handled that room better than most politicians." Aaliyah blinked, then laughed, a genuine laugh. Warm, unfiltered, the kind that instantly made other people smile too. "That's probably because teenagers don't pretend to agree with you." Eric laughed. "Fair enough. They'll tell you immediately if you're boring. Should I be concerned?" Aaliyah studied him for a moment. "How long were you standing there?" Eric immediately looked guilty, which answered the question. Aaliyah laughed harder. "Oh, wow. What? You've been there a while." "I wasn't spying. That's exactly what somebody spying would say." Eric shook his head. "I had a meeting." Convenient explanation. "I really did." Aaliyah crossed her arms playfully. "Do you have witnesses?" Eric stared at her, then laughed. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, the conversation felt easy, comfortable. Neither was trying to impress the other. Neither seemed interested in performing. That was rare in Washington. Very rare. Most conversations in the city felt transactional, people networking, positioning themselves, trying to gain something. This felt different. Aaliyah extended her hand. "Aaliyah Carter." Eric shook it. "Eric Thompson." For a second the handshake lingered. Not awkwardly, just long enough for both of them to notice. Neither mentioned it. A voice called Eric's name from down the hallway. His meeting, the reason he came, reality returning. Eric glanced toward the hall, then back at Aaliyah. "Looks like I should probably attend the meeting I came here for." "That would be a good start. You always this difficult?" Aaliyah smiled. "Only with strangers who watch me work." Eric laughed again. There it was. That feeling. Unexpected, simple, yet impossible to ignore. For the first time all afternoon he wasn't thinking about proposals or partnerships. He was thinking about her. As he walked toward the conference room, he glanced back once. Aaliyah had already returned to gathering materials, helping stack chairs, talking to students who still lingered nearby, completely unaware of the effect she had just had on him. Or perhaps she knew, and simply didn't care. Oddly enough, that possibility made her even more interesting. Eric entered his meeting, but his attention wasn't fully there anymore. Because for the first time in a long time he wasn't thinking about the future. He was thinking about seeing Aaliyah Carter again. Eric told himself he was too busy to think about Aaliyah. The excuse lasted less than 24 hours. The following morning, while reviewing paperwork at his office, he caught himself wondering whether she was running another youth session. By lunchtime he was wondering what kind of music she listened to. By evening, he was trying to come up with a reasonable excuse to visit the community center again. The problem was that every excuse sounded ridiculous. Fortunately, fate solved the problem for him. 3 days later, another partnership meeting brought him back to the center. This time Aaliyah spotted him first. "There he is," Eric smiled. "There who is. The man who claims he wasn't spying." "I wasn't spying." Aaliyah folded her arms. "Still sticking with that story? It happens to be true." "That's disappointing." Eric laughed. "Why?" So naturally that neither noticed they had spent nearly 20 minutes talking in the hallway. When Eric finally left, he asked a simple question. "Would you like dinner sometime?" Aaliyah looked at him, not surprised, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. "Are you asking because of the partnership?" "No." "Good answer. So?" A smile slowly appeared. "So maybe." "Maybe. Maybe means yes if you don't ruin it." Eric shook his head. "You drive a hard bargain. Life teaches you that." Their first date happened the following week, then another, then another. Eventually, neither could remember who suggested most of them. The relationship developed the way healthy relationships often do. Without pressure, without games, without forcing anything. Each conversation revealed something new. Each meeting made them curious about the next one. And slowly, two very different worlds began moving toward each other. Aaliyah's world was loud, warm, personal. People rarely knocked before entering. Everybody knew somebody's cousin. News traveled faster than the internet. Children played basketball until sunset. Neighbors borrowed things without returning them on time. And somehow nobody stayed angry for very long. Eric's world was different, professional, structured, carefully organized. People scheduled meetings weeks in advance. Every conversation seemed connected to business. Every event had a purpose. Every introduction carried potential opportunity. Neither world was wrong. They were simply different. The differences became obvious the first time Aaliyah invited Eric to a neighborhood cookout. The moment they arrived, Eric realized he had made a mistake. Not because he didn't want to be there, because he wasn't prepared. Music filled the air. Children raced through the park. The scent of barbecue drifted across the gathering. Families occupied folding chairs beneath large shade trees. And somehow everyone seemed to know exactly who Eric was. Or at least they wanted to know. Aaliyah barely had time to introduce him before questions started. "That's him? So this is Eric? He's taller than I expected." Eric looked at Aaliyah. "Aren't you going to help me?" "No." "Why not?" She grinned. "Because this is funny." A woman carrying a paper plate approached. She looked directly at Eric, studied him for several seconds, long enough to make him nervous, very nervous. Finally she spoke. "So what exactly are your intentions?" Eric nearly inhaled the wrong way. Aaliyah doubled over laughing. Several people nearby started laughing too. Eric looked trapped. "I wasn't aware this was an interview." "Oh, it is," the woman nodded. "A very important one." Aaliyah laughed so hard tears formed in her eyes. For years afterward, she would remind him about that moment. Every single chance she got. By the end of the afternoon, Eric had met what felt like half the city. He played basketball with teenagers, helped carry tables, lost badly in a cornhole game, and somehow enjoyed every minute. Driving home later that evening, he glanced toward Aaliyah. "You know your people interrogate strangers." "Our people?" Eric immediately realized his mistake. Aaliyah laughed. "Keep talking." "I meant your community. Too late." Eric groaned. "This conversation isn't ending, is it?" "Not for several years." She wasn't exaggerating. The following month, Eric introduced Aaliyah to his world, a fundraising gala in downtown Washington. The atmosphere felt completely different. Elegant lighting, formal attire, perfectly arranged tables. Conversations filled with business terminology. Everyone seemed polished, confident, accomplished. Aaliyah adjusted her dress as they entered. For the first time since they started dating, she looked slightly uncertain. Eric noticed immediately. Without saying a word, he reached for her hand. The gesture was simple, but it mattered. Aaliyah looked at him. "You sure I belong here?" Eric answered without hesitation. "Absolutely. You didn't even think about it." "Because the answer doesn't require thinking." Something softened in her expression. The rest of the evening became easier. Whenever introductions happened, Eric included her. Whenever conversations formed, he made space for her voice. Whenever people focused solely on him, he redirected attention. Not because he felt obligated, because he genuinely wanted her beside him. By the end of the night, Aaliyah was laughing comfortably with people she had been nervous to meet only hours earlier. Watching her adapt impressed Eric. She remained completely herself, no pretending, no performance, no effort to become someone else. She simply brought her own authenticity into every room. And people responded to it. That became one of the things Eric admired most. Months passed, the relationship deepened, trust grew naturally, neither felt pressured to impress the other anymore. The masks people often wear while dating slowly disappeared. One chilly autumn evening they found themselves sitting beside the Potomac River, the city lights reflected across the water. The air carried just enough cold to make people pull their jackets tighter. Traffic moved quietly in the distance. For a while neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. The kind shared by people who enjoy simply being together. Aaliyah rested her head against Eric's shoulder. He looked out across the river, then asked a question. "What do you really want?" Aaliyah lifted her head slightly. "What kind of question is that?" "A serious one." She studied him. "You're in a thoughtful mood." "Answer anyway." Aaliyah smiled. Then considered the question carefully. Unlike most people, she didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice carried certainty. "I want to help kids who think nobody believes in them." Eric listened. She continued, "I want them to understand they matter before life convinces them otherwise." The answer felt genuine, not rehearsed, not designed to sound impressive. It came from somewhere deep, Eric could tell. "What about you?" she asked. He looked toward the river. The lights danced across the water. For several seconds he considered his answer, then spoke honestly. "I want to build something important." Aaliyah nodded. "What kind of something?" "Something people remember." She smiled. "A legacy. Yeah. Aaliyah squeezed his hand. For a moment, both stared at the water. Two people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different journeys, yet somehow moving toward the same destination, or at least it seemed that way. Maybe we're not so different, Aaliyah said softly. Eric smiled. No, he squeezed her hand back. Maybe we're not. That night, sitting beside the Potomac, both believed they were looking at the same future. Both believed their values aligned. Both believed the dream ahead belonged equally to them. Neither realized how important that conversation would become years later. Because sometimes the words people say early in a relationship reveal everything. The meaning simply takes time to understand. And as Washington's lights reflected across the river, Aaliyah and Eric sat together believing they were building the same dream. For now, they were right, or at least close enough to believe it. The idea started around a folding table. No grand announcement, no wealthy investors, no major sponsorship, just two people sharing coffee and talking about problems they were tired of watching. The conversation began the way many important conversations do, with frustration. Aaliyah had spent years working with teenagers who needed opportunities. Eric had spent years building relationships with organizations that had resources. One evening, after another discussion about struggling students, Aaliyah leaned back in her chair. You know what bothers me? Eric looked up from his notes. What? We keep talking about helping people. Eric nodded. We do. But talking isn't helping them. A smile appeared on Eric's face. That sounds like a challenge. It is. Eric closed the folder in front of him. Good. That conversation became the beginning of everything. Within months, they started building an educational nonprofit focused on mentorship, scholarships, and career development for underserved students across Washington. At first, the organization barely existed. A borrowed office, second-hand furniture, an old printer that seemed determined to stop working every other day. There were evenings when they stayed until midnight preparing presentations. There were weekends spent writing grant applications. There were mornings that started with excitement and ended with disappointment. Some funding requests were rejected. Some partnerships fell through. Some programs failed to attract attention. Still, they kept going, because every time they considered slowing down, they met another student who reminded them why the work mattered. One winter evening, they sat alone in the office, surrounded by paperwork. Outside, snow drifted through the city. Inside, exhaustion filled the room. Aaliyah rubbed her eyes. I can't believe we're still here. Eric checked the clock. Neither could. It was nearly 11. We should go home. We said that 3 hours ago. That's true, Aaliyah laughed. The kind of laugh people share when they're too tired to care anymore. Eric looked around the room. Stacks of documents, budget projections, volunteer schedules, community outreach plans. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. For a moment, both felt proud. The organization slowly began growing. One student received a scholarship, then another. A mentorship program succeeded. A tutoring initiative expanded. Families started recommending the organization to other families. Word spread, not through advertisements, through results. Those small victories became fuel. Each success reminded them that progress mattered more than speed. One afternoon, Aaliyah met a teenager named Henry Brooks. At first, he barely spoke. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. Henry contributed maybe 10 sentences, most of them short, most of them guarded. Years of disappointment had taught him not to trust easily. Aaliyah noticed immediately. The worn backpack, the hesitation, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he seemed prepared for people to lose interest in him. Many adults had already done exactly that. After the meeting ended, Eric approached her. What do you think? Aaliyah watched Henry leave the building. I think he's carrying more than he should have to. Eric followed her gaze. You think he'll stay in the program? I don't know. You sound worried. Aaliyah nodded. Kids stop believing in themselves long before people realize it. That answer stayed with Eric. Over the following months, Aaliyah spent extra time helping Henry. Reviewing assignments, discussing college options, checking on him after difficult weeks, encouraging him when setbacks happened. The process wasn't dramatic. It was consistent, the kind of support many people overlook because it happens quietly. Henry rarely expressed gratitude, at least not openly. But Aaliyah never measured progress that way. She measured it through effort. And little by little, Henry started trying again. Meanwhile, the nonprofit continued expanding. More donors became interested. Community leaders took notice. Local media started calling. The organization's reputation grew across Washington. At first, the attention felt exciting. For both of them. A successful program earned positive coverage. A local newspaper requested interviews. Volunteers increased. Funding opportunities improved. Everything seemed headed in the right direction. Then the spotlight became larger, and something subtle began changing. Not suddenly, not enough for anyone to immediately recognize it, just enough to create discomfort. One afternoon, a reporter arrived to cover one of the nonprofit's biggest educational initiatives. The program had been largely designed by Aaliyah. She had spent months developing the structure, months testing ideas, months working directly with students. The reporter interviewed several staff members before eventually speaking with Eric. Aaliyah stood nearby speaking with volunteers. She wasn't paying much attention, until she heard something. The reporter smiled. "This program has received excellent feedback. How did the idea come together?" Aaliyah expected Eric to explain the team effort. Instead, he smiled and answered, "It started with a vision I had several years ago." The words were simple, almost harmless. Aaliyah frowned slightly. Maybe she misunderstood. Maybe he intended to explain further. Maybe her name would come up naturally, but it never did. The interview continued. The topic changed. The moment passed. Everyone returned to work. Yet something stayed with her. That evening, while driving home together, Aaliyah stared out the window. Washington's evening traffic crawled through the city. Headlights reflected across wet pavement. Eric glanced toward her. "You've been quiet." Aaliyah hesitated, then spoke. "Why didn't you mention the team?" Eric looked confused. "What do you mean? The interview?" "Oh." His tone sounded casual. Too casual. "You mean that?" "Yes." Eric shrugged. "It was just an interview." Aaliyah looked at him. "Exactly. What difference does it make?" The question caught her off guard. Not because of what he said, because of how easily he said it. What difference does it make? Aaliyah didn't answer immediately. She wasn't trying to start an argument. She genuinely wanted him to understand. People worked hard on that program. They know that. Do they? Eric sighed. "Aaliyah, no, seriously." She turned toward him. "Do they?" The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Neither raised their voice. Neither became angry. Yet the atmosphere changed. Something felt off, small, but noticeable, like a tiny crack appearing in a window. Easy to ignore. At first, the following months brought more opportunities, more interviews, more recognition, more invitations. The organization became one of Washington's most promising educational initiatives, and increasingly, journalists wanted to speak with Eric. He was charismatic, confident, comfortable in front of cameras. Naturally, attention followed him. Aaliyah didn't mind, at least not initially. What bothered her wasn't that Eric received attention. What bothered her was what started disappearing when he did. The team, the volunteers, the mentors, the people whose efforts made everything possible. One afternoon, a donor visited the office. During a meeting, the donor praised a mentorship strategy that had dramatically improved student participation. The strategy belonged to Aaliyah. Everyone in the organization knew that. The donor smiled. "Whoever came up with that idea deserves credit." Before Aaliyah could answer, Eric responded, "That was one of the initiatives I pushed hardest for." The room continued talking. Nobody reacted, nobody noticed, except Aaliyah. For a brief second, she simply sat there, listening, processing, wondering why the comment bothered her so much. Perhaps because it wasn't the first time, and deep down she knew it probably wouldn't be the last. That realization followed her home, followed her through meetings, followed her into quiet moments. Not because she wanted recognition, because she wanted honesty. One Saturday morning, months later, Aaliyah attended a student event. A young girl sat beside another student helping him finish a reading assignment. Patiently, encouragingly, without being asked. Aaliyah watched the interaction. The girl's mother smiled. "She learned that here." Aaliyah looked up. "What do you mean?" The woman pointed toward her daughter. "Helping people." The comment stayed with Aaliyah for the rest of the day. Because that was the impact she cared about. People helping people, students becoming leaders, kindness creating more kindness. That evening she returned home. Eric was getting ready for another formal event. Another speech. Another room filled with influential people. He adjusted his tie while looking into the mirror. Aaliyah stood quietly nearby, watching, thinking, remembering the conversation they shared beside the Potomac River years earlier. The conversation about purpose. The conversation about legacy. The conversation about dreams. For a long moment she simply observed him. Then a thought entered her mind. A thought she immediately wished she didn't have. Were they still building the same dream? Or had the dream quietly become two different things? Eric continued adjusting his tie, completely unaware of the question forming inside her. Aaliyah looked away. Because for the first time since they started building their future together, she wasn't sure she knew the answer. The year after the nonprofit's breakthrough became the busiest year of Aaliyah and Eric's lives. Growth arrived faster than either of them expected. Programs expanded into additional neighborhoods. Volunteer applications increased. Corporate sponsors reached out. Community leaders requested partnerships. Organizations that once ignored their emails suddenly wanted meetings. Success brought opportunity. Opportunity brought attention. And attention changed the pace of everything. The office that once felt too large now felt too small. Phones rang constantly. Calendars filled weeks in advance. Every available wall seemed covered with schedules, goals, deadlines, and upcoming events. For a while the pressure felt exciting. They had worked for this, sacrificed for this, earned this. One Monday morning, Aaliyah entered the office carrying coffee for herself and Eric. Before she reached her desk, she noticed 3 separate people waiting in the lobby. A volunteer coordinator, a local sponsor, a journalist, all before 9 o'clock. She laughed quietly. "We used to celebrate getting one phone call." Eric looked up from his laptop. "Now we're turning people away." Aaliyah smiled. It felt good. The mission was growing. The students were benefiting. That was what mattered, at least to her. Over the following months, media coverage increased dramatically. Newspapers featured success stories from their programs. Local television stations requested interviews. Podcasts invited Eric to discuss educational reform. Magazine articles highlighted the nonprofit's growth. At first, Eric tried including everyone. Whenever reporters called, he mentioned the team. Whenever interviews happened, he acknowledged staff contributions. Whenever someone praised him, he redirected some of that praise. But gradually something changed. The more recognition arrived, the more comfortable he became receiving it. One afternoon, a television crew arrived to film a segment about student mentorship. Aaliyah spent most of the day helping students prepare, making sure nobody felt nervous, making sure everyone understood they didn't need perfect answers, making sure the spotlight stayed where it belonged, on the students. Meanwhile, Eric worked with the production team, adjusting schedules, reviewing interview topics, planning talking points. Nothing unusual, nothing inappropriate. Yet when filming finally began, something stood out. The cameras followed Eric almost everywhere. The producers constantly asked for his opinion, his perspective, his vision, his leadership. By the end of the day, Aaliyah realized she had barely appeared on camera at all, not because anyone deliberately excluded her. Because Eric had become the public face of the organization, the realization bothered her less than she expected. Until she overheard a conversation. A teenager pointed toward Eric. "That's the guy who started everything, right?" The question wasn't malicious. The teenager genuinely believed it. Aaliyah froze for half a second, then continued walking. The comment followed her throughout the day, not because it hurt her feelings, because it wasn't true. And the farther the story traveled from reality, the harder it would become to correct. The months continued moving quickly. Fundraising records reached new highs. Program enrollment increased. Partnerships expanded. Donors became increasingly interested in supporting the organization. Some donated because they believed in the mission. Others donated because the nonprofit had become visible. Visibility attracted money. Money attracted more visibility. The cycle continued. One evening, Eric and Aaliyah attended a donor reception at a downtown hotel. The ballroom buzzed with conversation. Business leaders moved between tables. Community advocates exchanged ideas. Potential supporters discussed future investments. Throughout the evening, people approached Eric repeatedly. Congratulations, compliments, praise, recognition. The interactions happened so frequently that Aaliyah barely had time to speak with him. At one point, she stood alone near a display table watching Eric across the room. He was smiling, laughing, telling stories, comfortable, confident. He looked like someone who belonged there. A donor shook Eric's hand enthusiastically. Another asked for a photograph. A third requested a future meeting. The attention never seemed to stop. Aaliyah watched for a moment, then quietly returned to conversations with volunteers. Because while Eric was building relationships with donors, she remained focused on the people actually using their programs. Students, families, mentors, the people whose lives changed when the work succeeded. A few weeks later, Aaliyah spent an entire Saturday visiting program sites across Washington. The day began before sunrise. It ended after dark. By evening, she was exhausted, yet strangely happy. A young student had improved his grades. Another had been accepted into a summer program. A family had received support during a difficult situation. Small victories, Nothing that would appear in newspapers, nothing that would attract television cameras. Yet those moments mattered. Driving home that night, she found herself smiling. The work still meant something, even if nobody reported on it. The following Tuesday, she arrived at the office and noticed a framed magazine cover sitting on Eric's desk. His photograph filled the front page. The headline praised his leadership, his vision, his success. Aaliyah picked it up, read the article, then read it again. Her smile slowly faded. The article mentioned volunteers, briefly. It mentioned staff, briefly. It mentioned students, briefly. But nowhere did it mention her, not once. Aaliyah placed the magazine back on the desk, carefully, quietly. She wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly confused. How had the story drifted this far? Later that afternoon, Eric entered the office carrying another invitation. "A national conference wants me to speak." Aaliyah looked up. "That's great. It could open huge opportunities. I'm sure it could." Eric smiled, excited, energetic, focused on what came next. Aaliyah smiled back. But something felt different now. Not wrong, just different. Like two people walking the same road while looking in opposite directions. That feeling grew stronger over the following weeks. Eric's schedule became increasingly filled with interviews, conferences, and public appearances. Aaliyah's schedule became increasingly filled with students, families, and community work. Both remained busy. Both remained committed. Yet the distance between their priorities slowly widened. One afternoon, a volunteer made an innocent comment. "We're lucky Eric created all this." The words weren't intended to hurt. The volunteer believed them. Aaliyah nodded politely, then continued working. But after the volunteer walked away, she sat quietly for a moment. Because comments like that were becoming more common. Far more common. And every time she heard one, the same question returned, not whether Eric deserved credit. He did. The organization would never have reached this point without him. The real question was different. Why was everyone else's contribution slowly disappearing, especially hers? That evening, long after most employees had gone home, Aaliyah stood alone near the office window overlooking Washington. Lights stretched across the city. Cars moved through the streets below. Inside the office, silence finally replaced the noise of the day. She folded her arms and stared out at the skyline. Months earlier, she had asked herself whether they were still building the same dream. Now another question appeared, and this one felt harder to ignore. If the world already believed the organization belonged to Eric alone, how much longer would it be before Eric started believing it too? The warning signs had been there for months. Small moments, comments that felt slightly off, conversations that left Aaliyah unsettled, credit that slowly drifted in one direction. She noticed them, questioned them, then often convinced herself she was overthinking. After all, Eric had helped build the organization from the beginning. He worked hard. He sacrificed. He cared about the mission. At least he used to. So whenever doubt appeared, she pushed it away. Until the morning she walked into the boardroom. That was the day she could no longer ignore it. 3 months earlier, Aaliyah had started working on a new initiative. The idea came after speaking with dozens of teenagers aging out of foster care. Many were intelligent, motivated, capable, yet they faced a difficult reality. Once they entered adulthood, support systems often disappeared. Some struggled finding jobs, others struggled finding mentors. Many felt completely alone. The more stories Aaliyah heard, the more determined she became. For weeks she conducted interviews, collected research, met with educators, spoke with employers, reviewed statistics. She worked late almost every evening. Some nights she arrived home after Eric was already asleep. Other nights she sat at the dining room table surrounded by papers until midnight. The proposal eventually became one of the strongest projects she had ever developed. Detailed, practical, affordable, most importantly, necessary. The board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning. Aaliyah felt excited, not because she wanted recognition, because she genuinely believed the initiative could change lives. That morning she arrived carrying a folder containing months of work. As she approached the conference room, she heard voices inside. Board members had already gathered. Several donors were attending virtually. Everything seemed normal. Then she opened the door, and immediately stopped. A presentation filled the large screen at the front of the room. Her presentation, her charts, her research, her proposal. Aaliyah frowned. Maybe Eric was introducing the project before she presented. That would make sense. She quietly took her seat. Eric stood near the screen. Confident, prepared, professional. The room listened attentively. Aaliyah waited for him to hand the presentation over. A few minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Eric continued speaking. Still no introduction, still no invitation, still no mention of her name. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. The board members appeared impressed. Several nodded as Eric explained the details. Others took notes. A donor asked a question. Eric answered. Another question followed. Eric answered again. Then came the moment that changed everything. One board member smiled. "This is excellent work." Several people agreed. The board member continued. "What inspired you to create this program?" Aaliyah instinctively looked toward Eric. Surely now he would explain. Surely now he would acknowledge where the proposal came from. Instead, Eric smiled. "A lot of conversations with young people helped shape the vision." The answer sounded harmless, until he continued. "I've been thinking about this issue for a long time." Aaliyah felt her heart sink, because the room accepted the statement immediately. No hesitation, no questions, no clarification, nothing. The discussion moved forward. Board members praised the proposal, donors complimented the strategy, everyone congratulated Eric, and Aaliyah sat silently watching months of her work become someone else's achievement. For a moment she couldn't even process it. The betrayal felt too large, too unexpected, too public. The meeting eventually ended. People gathered their materials. Conversations filled the room. Several board members approached Eric, offering congratulations, shaking his hand, discussing next steps. Nobody noticed Aaliyah standing near the window. Nobody except Eric. Their eyes met. A brief moment. Long enough for him to understand. Long enough for her to know he understood. Neither spoke. Not there, not in front of everyone. But the conversation was coming. Both knew it. The drive home felt unusually quiet. Traffic moved through downtown Washington. Radio noise filled the silence between them. Neither seemed interested in speaking first. Finally, Eric pulled into the driveway. The engine stopped. The silence remained. Aaliyah opened her door, entered the house, set her bag down, then turned toward him. "Why?" Eric immediately looked tired. Not surprised, not confused, tired, as though he expected the question. "Aaliyah, no." Her voice remained calm, dangerously calm. "Why?" Eric loosened his tie. "It's not that simple." The answer made her laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. "It actually is. Aaliyah, you presented my proposal. We work together." The words landed badly, very badly. Aaliyah stared at him. "We work together?" "Yes." "That's your explanation?" Eric rubbed his forehead. "You know what I mean." "No." She shook her head. "I really don't." For the first time, frustration appeared on Eric's face. "Aren't we supposed to be on the same side?" Aaliyah blinked. The question felt almost insulting. "The same side?" "Yes." "Then why did I spend 3 months building that proposal if you were going to present it as your own?" Eric exhaled sharply. "Nobody said it was mine." Aaliyah stared at him. "You stood in front of that board for nearly an hour. So? You answered every question. I was leading the meeting. You accepted every compliment." Eric's jaw tightened. The room suddenly felt smaller, more tense, more uncomfortable. "What exactly do you want from me?" he asked. The question hurt more than she expected, because she didn't want anything unreasonable. Not praise, not applause, not awards, just honesty. "I wanted you to tell the truth." The words hung between them. Eric looked away first. That told her more than any answer could. For several seconds neither spoke. The distance between them felt larger than the living room itself. Finally, Eric broke the silence. "You're making this personal." Aaliyah stared at him. The statement stunned her. Not because she hadn't heard it before, because he actually believed it. Personal? Months of work, months of effort, months of sacrifice, and somehow she was the one making things personal. Aaliyah slowly shook her head. "No." Her voice softened, which somehow sounded sadder. "I'm responding to something personal." Eric looked frustrated, defensive, cornered. Anything except remorseful. That realization hurt. Because until that moment, Aaliyah believed he would eventually understand, eventually apologize, eventually recognize what happened. Now she wasn't so sure. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. Neither raised their voice, neither stormed out, neither said anything cruel. In some ways that made it worse, because the disagreement wasn't about one presentation. It wasn't about one meeting. It wasn't even about one proposal. It was about values, about priorities, about two people who once looked toward the same future and no longer seemed to see the same thing. By the time the conversation ended, nothing had been resolved. No apology came, no understanding arrived, no healing occurred, only exhaustion. That night, they prepared for bed in near silence. The familiar routine suddenly felt unfamiliar. Aaliyah brushed her teeth. Eric checked his phone. Both occupied the same room. Yet emotionally they felt miles apart. When the lights finally went out, neither fell asleep quickly. Aaliyah stared into the darkness, remembering the boardroom, remembering the presentation, remembering the applause. Most of all, remembering the look on Eric's face when she confronted him. Not guilt, not regret, just justification. And for the first time since they met at that community center years earlier, Aaliyah began wondering whether the man she married was slowly becoming someone she no longer recognized. Because trust rarely disappears all at once. Usually it fades in small pieces. One disappointment at a time. One excuse at a time. One unanswered question at a time. And lying awake beside Eric that night, Aaliyah could feel another piece slipping away. The weeks following the boardroom confrontation felt different. Not louder, not more dramatic, just colder. Aaliyah noticed it in the quiet moments. The moments couples usually don't think about. Breakfast conversations became shorter. Car rides became quieter. Evenings became more distant. Nothing had officially broken. Yet something important no longer felt secure. The hardest part was that life continued moving forward. The nonprofit still operated. Programs still needed attention. Students still needed support. Donors still scheduled meetings. No matter what was happening inside their marriage, the mission continued. So both of them kept working, kept smiling in public, kept showing up, kept pretending everything was fine. At least most of the time. One Thursday afternoon, Eric entered the office carrying a black envelope. Aaliyah looked up from her desk. "What is it?" Eric smiled. "Invitation." She waited. "A fundraising gala. Another one?" "This one's different." His excitement was obvious. Aaliyah could hear it immediately. "The governor will be there." She nodded politely. Several months ago she would have shared his enthusiasm. Now she simply listened. "National donors, too." "That's good." Eric studied her for a moment. "You don't seem excited." Aaliyah offered a small smile. "I'm tired." It wasn't entirely a lie. She was tired. Just not physically, emotionally. A week later they arrived at the gala. The event occupied one of Washington's most prestigious hotels. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings. Elegant music drifted through the ballroom. Hundreds of guests moved through the room dressed in expensive suits and formal gowns. The atmosphere carried importance. The kind of importance people spend years trying to reach. As they entered, several guests immediately approached Eric. Handshakes, greetings, congratulations, questions. The pattern had become familiar. Aaliyah remained beside him initially, then eventually drifted toward other conversations, not because she wanted distance, because there simply wasn't room. The evening continued. Guests filled tables. Servers moved gracefully between groups. Donors discussed future partnerships. Community leaders exchanged ideas. The nonprofit's success had become one of the event's most celebrated topics, and once again, Eric stood at the center of the attention. Hours later, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. A microphone squealed briefly. The room settled. The host smiled. "Tonight we'd like to recognize several organizations making a difference throughout Washington." Applause followed. Names were announced. Programs were highlighted. Achievements were celebrated. Then came Eric's turn. The host introduced him enthusiastically. The applause grew louder. Eric stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the stage. Aaliyah watched from her seat. Part of her still felt proud, despite everything. Because she remembered where the journey started. The folding tables, the late nights, the borrowed office, the impossible goals, the dream they once shared. Eric reached the podium. The room quieted. He smiled confidently, then began speaking. At first everything sounded normal. He thanked supporters, acknowledged donors, praised community involvement. Aaliyah relaxed slightly. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe the boardroom incident had been an exception. Maybe she had worried too much. Then the language began changing. My vision, my leadership, my strategy, my initiative. The phrases appeared repeatedly, again and again and again. Aaliyah felt her stomach tighten. The speech continued. Several major programs were discussed. Programs she helped create. Programs she spent years developing. Programs she sacrificed for. Yet her name never appeared. Not once. 10 minutes passed. Still nothing. 15 minutes. Still nothing. Not a single acknowledgement. Not a single mention. Not a single moment of recognition. The audience applauded repeatedly throughout the speech. They had no reason not to. Most believed everything they were hearing. Most had never seen the long nights, the missed weekends, the difficult conversations with students, the endless planning sessions. They only knew the public version of the story. And the public version increasingly had one main character, Eric. By the time the speech ended, the applause was overwhelming. Guests rose from their seats. Some offered a standing ovation, others cheered. Several donors looked genuinely impressed. Aaliyah smiled politely, then quietly stood, without drawing attention, without interrupting anyone, without making a scene. She slipped out of the ballroom. The cool night air greeted her immediately. Washington's streets glowed beneath city lights. Traffic moved steadily in the distance. For the first time all evening, silence surrounded her. Aaliyah walked toward a nearby terrace overlooking part of the city. She stopped near the railing, folded her arms, and stared out into the darkness. She wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier. Instead, she felt disappointed. The kind of disappointment that settles deep. The kind that arrives when someone repeatedly shows you exactly who they are, and you finally stop making excuses. The ballroom doors opened behind her. She ignored the sound. Several seconds passed. Then a voice spoke. "Miss Carter?" Aaliyah turned. A young man stood nearby. Well-dressed, nervous. Holding a glass he clearly wasn't interested in drinking. For a moment she searched her memory, then smiled. Recognition arrived. Not immediately, but eventually. "You look familiar." The young man laughed. "I hope that's a good sign." "It depends." Aaliyah smiled. "Should I be worried?" The young man laughed again. A genuine laugh. The kind people can't fake. "No." He shook his head. "You helped me years ago." Aaliyah studied him, then suddenly remembered. A student. One of many. Yet somehow she remembered. His face brightened when he realized she recognized him. "I graduated." Aaliyah's eyes widened. "You did?" "Last year." The pride in his voice was impossible to miss. For a brief moment neither spoke. Then the young man looked down, gathering himself. When he looked back up, his expression had changed, more serious, more emotional. "My family never thought college would happen." Aaliyah listened quietly. "I didn't think it would happen either." The city noise seemed distant now, the ballroom noise even farther away. Only the conversation mattered. The young man smiled. "You believed in me before I believed in myself." Aaliyah felt something catch in her chest. Because those words meant more than any award ever could. The young man continued. "I just wanted to say thank you." His voice softened. "My life is different because somebody took the time to care." Aaliyah blinked rapidly, trying not to cry, trying not to let the moment overwhelm her. Inside the ballroom, applause still echoed. People still celebrated speeches, still celebrated leadership, still celebrated public success. Out here, beneath the night sky, one life was telling her the truth. The work mattered. Not the headlines, not the attention. The work. Aaliyah smiled, a real smile, the first real smile she had worn all evening. "You did the hard part." The young man shook his head. "No." His answer came immediately. "Me believe I could." For several seconds neither spoke. The emotion sat comfortably between them. No speeches, no spotlight, no audience, just gratitude, just impact. Just proof that the years of effort meant something. Eventually the young man returned inside. Aaliyah remained on the terrace, looking out across Washington, thinking, reflecting, trying to understand what her future looked like, and for the first time, a painful realization settled into place. The problem wasn't just her marriage anymore. The problem was the story people believed. The narrative had changed, slowly, quietly, consistently. And now an uncomfortable truth stood directly in front of her. People weren't simply giving Eric more credit. Many genuinely believed he deserved all of it. Which brings me to a question for you. What matters more, recognition or impact? Recognition can fill a room. Impact can change a life. Recognition can create headlines. Impact can create futures. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Because Aaliyah was beginning to learn that the answer could change everything. As she stood beneath the Washington night sky, another thought entered her mind. One she could no longer ignore. She might be losing her marriage, and if things continued the way they were going, she might be losing her reputation too. The terrifying part? She wasn't sure which loss would hurt more. The trouble with broken relationships is that most people don't notice them breaking. They notice the ending. The signed papers, the separate homes, the public announcement, the visible pieces. What they don't see are the hundreds of smaller moments that come first. The conversations that stop happening. The questions that stop being asked. The silence that slowly replaces laughter. For Aaliyah and Eric, those moments began multiplying after the gala. The drive home that night lasted nearly 30 minutes. Neither spoke. The city lights passed outside the windows, traffic moved around them, the radio played softly in the background. Neither seemed interested in listening. Aaliyah stared out the passenger window. Eric kept both hands on the steering wheel. Years earlier, silence between them felt comfortable. Now it felt exhausting. By the time they reached home, both went through their routines almost automatically. Shoes removed, lights turned off, doors locked. Yet even standing a few feet apart, they felt distant. That distance continued growing, not all at once. Gradually, one evening Aaliyah sat at the kitchen table reviewing student reports. Eric entered carrying his phone, his expression bright, excited. "A national magazine wants an interview." Aaliyah looked up. "Congratulations." The answer was sincere, but short. Eric noticed immediately. "You don't sound happy." Aaliyah closed the folder. "I'm tired. You've said that a lot lately." The comment lingered. Not quite an accusation, not quite concern, something in between. Aaliyah studied him. "You really don't know what's wrong?" The room became quiet. Eric looked away briefly, then back at her. "We've talked about this already." "No." Aaliyah shook her head. "We've avoided it already." The difference mattered, at least to her. The discussion that followed lasted less than 10 minutes. Yet somehow both walked away frustrated. That became the pattern. Small disagreements, small frustrations, small disappointments, none large enough to end a marriage. Together, however, they became impossible to ignore. Weeks passed, then months. The emotional distance widened. Aaliyah spent more time focused on students. Eric spent more time focused on expansion opportunities. Sometimes entire days passed with only practical conversations between them. Schedules, meetings, appointments, responsibilities. The relationship itself rarely entered the discussion. One Saturday morning they attended a community event together. Years earlier, events like this energized them. They worked side by side, shared jokes, finished each other's thoughts. Now something felt different. Guests still greeted them warmly. Volunteers still appreciated their presence. From a distance, everything appeared normal, but appearances can be misleading. Several times throughout the event, people approached Eric directly, praising his leadership, thanking him for the organization's success. Aaliyah stood nearby, listening, watching. Not one person intended disrespect. They simply believed the version of the story they had heard. The version where Eric stood at the center. The version where everyone else occupied the background. Driving home afterward, neither mentioned it. Neither needed to. The silence said enough. Eventually the arguments became more direct, not louder, more honest. One night, after another frustrating week, Aaliyah finally asked the question she had been avoiding. "Do you still remember why we started this?" Eric looked up from his laptop. "What kind of question is that?" "A real one." Eric closed the computer slowly. The tension appeared immediately. "We started because we wanted to help people." "Both of us?" The question irritated him. "Of course, both of us." Aaliyah held his gaze. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Eric sighed. "You always assume the worst now." The words hurt, because they weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. Aaliyah wasn't assuming, she was observing, and what she observed frightened her. The arguments continued over the following months. Some ended quickly, others lasted hours. Most solved nothing. The hardest part wasn't disagreement. The hardest part was feeling unheard. Both believed the other person no longer understood them. Both felt disappointed. Both felt defensive. Neither seemed capable of finding their way back. Eventually the conversation everyone dreads finally happened. Not dramatically, not during a fight, not after some explosive event, just two exhausted people sitting across from each other at home. Aaliyah spoke first. "We can't keep doing this." He said nothing. That silence became an answer. The discussion that followed felt strangely calm. Painful, but calm. By the end of the evening both understood where things were heading. Neither wanted to admit it. Neither argued against it. That was the saddest part. When people stop fighting for a relationship, the ending often arrives soon afterward. A few weeks later, lawyers entered the picture. The moment felt surreal. Documents replaced conversations. Schedules replaced discussions. Formal procedures replaced personal understanding. Aaliyah hated every second of it. Not because she wanted conflict, because she never imagined things would reach this point. Eric appeared equally uncomfortable, yet neither knew how to reverse course. The process moved forward, slowly, relentlessly. Friends began hearing pieces of the story. Questions followed, speculation followed, opinions followed. Some people quietly supported Aaliyah. Others supported Eric. Many avoided taking sides publicly while making private judgments. That reality surprised Aaliyah more than she expected, not because people disagreed, because so many seemed certain about situations they didn't understand. One afternoon she received a message from someone she considered a friend. The tone felt distant, careful, different. After reading it, Aaliyah sat silently for several minutes. The message wasn't cruel, yet it revealed something painful. People were already choosing narratives, already deciding who deserved sympathy, already deciding who deserved blame. Across Washington, Eric experienced similar situations. Professional relationships became complicated. Social invitations changed. Conversations felt uncomfortable. The divorce was affecting everything around them, not just the marriage itself. By the time winter arrived, both understood the truth. The relationship that began in a community center years earlier was approaching its final chapter. Neither felt victorious. Neither felt relieved. Mostly they felt tired. Tired of hurting. Tired of arguing. Tired of pretending things were repairable when neither knew how to repair them. One evening, Aaliyah sat alone in the living room after Eric had gone upstairs. The house felt unusually quiet. She looked around the room. Photographs, memories, pieces of a life they built together. For a moment she remembered the Potomac River, the conversation about dreams, the conversation about legacy, the belief that they were moving toward the same future. Aaliyah lowered her eyes. Because somewhere along the way, that future disappeared. And now lawyers, paperwork, and silence occupied the space where hope used to live. The marriage wasn't officially over yet, but deep inside, Aaliyah already knew something heartbreaking. The ending had begun. Nobody tells you how strange it feels when a chapter of your life officially ends. People talk about heartbreak, they talk about grief, they talk about moving on. But very few people talk about the silence that arrives when there is nothing left to fight for, nothing left to explain, nothing left to fix. For Aaliyah, that silence arrived on a gray Thursday morning. Washington woke beneath heavy clouds. Rain tapped against windows. Traffic moved slowly through wet streets. Pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas. The city continued its routine, unbothered, unchanged, as if thousands of personal stories weren't beginning and ending every single day. Aaliyah sat quietly inside a rideshare vehicle as it moved toward the courthouse. She stared out the window. The passing buildings blurred behind rain-streaked glass. Her hands rested in her lap. Calm on the outside, anything but calm underneath. The driver spoke once, commented on the weather. Aaliyah smiled politely, then returned to silence. She wasn't in the mood for conversation. Not today. The courthouse came into view, large, formal, impersonal, the kind of building designed for decisions rather than emotions. Aaliyah stepped outside. Rain fell steadily around her. She opened an umbrella and walked toward the entrance. Each step felt heavier than it should have. Not because she still believed the marriage could be saved. That belief had disappeared months ago. What hurt was something else. The realization that the future she once imagined would never happen. The future she and Eric talked about beside the Potomac River. The future they built toward during long nights in the nonprofit's early days. The future they once believed belonged to both of them. Gone. Not stolen, not destroyed, simply gone. Inside the courthouse, everything felt efficient, professional, routine. People moved through hallways carrying files and paperwork. Conversations happened in low voices. Doors opened, doors closed. Life-changing moments occurred in ordinary rooms. Aaliyah sat quietly waiting. Several chairs away sat Eric. The distance between them wasn't large, yet it felt enormous. Neither spoke. Both understood there was nothing left to say. Months earlier they would have filled silence easily. Years earlier they would have laughed together. Now they simply waited. Two people connected by history, separated by reality. Aaliyah glanced toward him briefly. For a second she saw traces of the man she met in that community center years ago. The man who admired her passion. The man who made her laugh. The man who believed in the same mission. All that remained was sadness. Not anger. Sadness. Eventually their names were called. The final process began. Documents were reviewed. Questions were answered. Procedures were completed. Everything happened exactly as it was supposed to. That somehow made it worse. Because life-changing moments should feel dramatic. This one didn't. It felt administrative. A signature here, a signature there, a few formal statements, a few legal confirmations. Then it was done. Years of marriage reduced to paperwork. The judge finalized everything. The process ended, officially, legally, completely. For a few seconds nobody moved. Then chairs shifted, folders closed, people gathered their belongings. The room returned to business as usual, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Aaliyah stood slowly. Her chest felt tight. Not from regret, from grief. Grief for what had been, grief for what could have been. Grief for the version of their story that never reached the ending they once imagined. She walked toward the exit. The hallway seemed longer than before. The sounds around her felt distant, muted, almost unreal. Outside, rain continued falling. The sky remained heavy and dark. Aaliyah stopped beneath the courthouse steps. For a moment she simply stood there, watching cars move through the street, watching strangers hurry past, watching life continue. The world had not stopped, even though part of hers had. She eventually crossed the street and found a bench beneath a covered area. The rain drummed against the roof overhead. Water rushed along the curb. The city carried on around her. For the first time all day, she was completely alone. And that was when the emotions finally arrived. Not dramatically, not uncontrollably, quietly. A few tears escaped, then a few more. Aaliyah lowered her head, letting herself feel the weight of everything. The marriage, the disappointment, the public perception, the years, the sacrifices, all of it. For several minutes she sat there, not trying to be strong, not trying to be brave, just honest. Then her phone vibrated. A small sound, barely noticeable. Under normal circumstances she might have ignored it. Today she looked immediately. Anything felt better than sitting alone with her thoughts. She unlocked the screen. A message waited. The sender's name instantly looked familiar. One of her former students. Someone she had mentored years earlier. Aaliyah opened the message. A photograph appeared. Graduation cap. Huge smile. Proud eyes. A future unfolding. Below the picture was a short message. I graduated today. Aaliyah blinked, then smiled despite herself. The student continued. Couldn't have done it without you. For a moment the courthouse disappeared. The rain disappeared. The pain disappeared. Not completely, but enough. Enough to create space for something else. Perspective. Aaliyah stared at the photograph. Read the message again, then again. The timing felt almost impossible. Of all days, of all moments, of all hours, today. The student had no idea what she was going through. No idea she had just walked out of a courthouse. No idea she was sitting alone trying to figure out how to rebuild her life. Yet somehow the message arrived exactly when she needed it. Aaliyah laughed softly through tears. A strange combination of sadness and gratitude. The feeling surprised her. The marriage had ended. That reality wasn't changing. The hurt was real, the disappointment was real, the loss was real. But another truth was also real. The years she spent helping people mattered. The students mattered. The lives touched through. The work mattered. Nobody could erase that. Not a divorce, not a headline, not public opinion, not anything. Aaliyah looked at the photograph one more time, then typed a reply. Simple, sincere, heartfelt. After sending it, she lowered the phone and looked out toward the rain. The world still felt uncertain. Her future still felt unclear. But for the first time in months, a small feeling returned. Hope. Not the kind that arrives loudly. Not the kind that solves every problem. The quiet kind. The kind that whispers. The kind that says, keep going. The kind that reminds people there is still life after disappointment. Still purpose after loss. Still meaning after endings. Aaliyah stood from the bench, took a deep breath, and stepped back into the rain. The marriage was over. That chapter had closed. But somewhere ahead, another chapter was waiting. She just didn't know it yet. And neither did the young man whose graduation photo had just changed the worst day of her life. The first few weeks after the divorce felt strange, not because life stopped, because it didn't. That was the surprising part. The sun still rose every morning. Traffic still filled Washington streets. Coffee shops still opened. Students still attended school. The world continued moving forward, even when Aaliyah felt like standing still. At first, she wasn't sure what to do with the silence. For years, her life had been connected to Eric's, shared schedules, shared goals, shared responsibilities. Now the structure that once defined her daily routine no longer existed. The adjustment wasn't easy. Some mornings felt heavier than others. Some evenings felt longer than they should. The apartment she moved into was considerably smaller than the home she once shared with Eric. The living room could fit inside their former dining area. The kitchen barely had enough counter space. The bedroom overlooked a parking lot instead of a tree-lined neighborhood. Yet strangely, she didn't hate it. The space felt simple, honest, manageable. For the first time in years, her surroundings reflected only her life. No expectations, no appearances, no pressure. Just peace, even if the peace occasionally felt lonely. Financially, things became tighter. The divorce had changed everything. Aaliyah no longer had access to the same resources, the same opportunities, the same professional influence. She began taking consulting work where she could find it. Some projects paid well, others barely covered expenses. She adjusted, because that was what life required. One evening she sat at her small kitchen table reviewing bills. The numbers weren't disastrous, but they demanded attention, a reality she hadn't faced in years. Aaliyah looked at the calculator, then laughed quietly, not because anything was funny, because life had a way of humbling people. Years earlier she had helped manage budgets affecting thousands of students. Now she was debating whether replacing a broken appliance should wait another month. The contrast wasn't lost on her. Yet even during difficult moments she noticed something surprising. She felt lighter, not happier, not yet, but lighter. The constant tension that had followed her marriage's final years had disappeared. No more uncomfortable silence at dinner. No more wondering whether difficult conversations would become arguments. No more questioning whether someone valued her contributions. The pain remained, but the pressure was gone, and that mattered. As the months passed, Aaliyah focused on what she knew best: people, community, service. She volunteered whenever possible, mentored students, assisted local organizations, helped families navigate educational resources, not because anyone asked her to, because she genuinely loved the work. One afternoon, a former colleague approached her after a community event. The conversation remained polite, professional, brief, yet something about it bothered her afterward. Not what was said, what wasn't said. The colleague spoke about the nonprofit, about recent achievements, about Eric's growing reputation, yet never once acknowledged Aaliyah's role in building it. The omission wasn't intentional. That was the problem. People increasingly accepted a version of history where Eric stood alone. Aaliyah walked home that evening thinking about it. Not angry, just disappointed. Because reputations don't disappear overnight. Sometimes they fade gradually, one conversation at a time, one assumption at a time, one forgotten contribution at a time. Still, she kept moving forward, because she had learned something important. Bitterness rarely improves anyone's future. One Saturday afternoon, a neighborhood basketball tournament brought dozens of teenagers together at a local park. The atmosphere felt energetic. Music played nearby. Parents cheered from folding chairs. Players argued over calls. Friends laughed from the sidelines. The environment reminded Aaliyah why she loved community spaces. Real people, real conversations, real life. As she walked toward the court, several teenagers spotted her immediately. Their reaction was impossible to miss. "Miss Carter! Aaliyah! You actually came!" Aaliyah laughed. "Good to see you too." Several players hurried over. The greetings felt genuine, excited, warm. One teenager pointed dramatically. "You still owe me." Aaliyah stopped. "Oh no." The teenager grinned. "Oh yes." Several others immediately started laughing. Aaliyah already knew where this was going. Years earlier, she had made a mistake. A very public mistake, a basketball mistake. She had confidently challenged one of the teenagers to a shooting contest. The outcome had been embarrassing. For her, not for him. The teenager never allowed her to forget it. "You promised a rematch." "I absolutely did not." "You did." "I really didn't." The teenager pointed toward the court. Witnesses immediately joined the argument. None of them supported Aaliyah. Not a single one. The betrayal felt personal. "Wow." Aaliyah placed a hand over her heart. "Nobody's on my side. Not today." The teenager laughed. Within minutes, a crowd gathered around the basket. The rematch happened. The result? Slightly less embarrassing. Only slightly. The teenagers celebrated like they had won a championship. Aaliyah laughed so hard her stomach hurt. For several minutes she forgot everything. The divorce, the professional setbacks, the uncertainty, all of it. She simply enjoyed the moment. That evening, while driving home, she realized something. The laughter had been real. Not forced, not polite, real. It was the first time in months she felt completely present. The realization stayed with her. Because healing often arrives quietly. Not through dramatic breakthroughs, through moments, tiny moments, moments that remind people they are still capable of joy. Meanwhile, across Washington, Eric's life continued moving in a very different direction. His reputation had never been stronger. Speaking invitations increased. National organizations requested meetings. Donors competed for his attention. Awards committees noticed his work. One recognition stood above the others: the National Community Impact Leadership Award. Winning it would place him among the most respected nonprofit leaders in the country. The nomination alone attracted significant attention. Eric prepared carefully, reviewing speeches, attending interviews, meeting influential supporters. Everything seemed to be aligning perfectly. The future looked bright, at least from his perspective. What Eric didn't know was that events had already begun moving beyond his control. Hundreds of miles away, another story was developing. Quietly, patiently, without publicity, without attention, Henry Brooks sat inside an office reviewing documents. The same Henry who once struggled to believe in himself, the same Henry Aaliyah refused to give up on. Years had changed him. The shy teenager was gone. In his place stood a respected attorney known for thorough work and careful attention to detail. A non-profit review had recently landed on his desk. At first the assignment seemed routine, nothing unusual, nothing urgent. Then he started reading program reports, grant records, strategic proposals, historical planning documents. The deeper he looked, the more questions appeared. One document mentioned Aaliyah, another highlighted her leadership, a third revealed extensive involvement, then another, and another. Patterns emerged, patterns that didn't match public perception. Henry leaned back in his chair, thinking, reviewing, questioning. Something felt wrong, not illegal, not criminal, wrong. The deeper he investigated, the more curious he became. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Henry continued gathering information, carefully, methodically, building a complete picture. And the picture becoming visible differed dramatically from the narrative most people believed. One evening, long after sunset, Henry closed the final file on his desk. The office sat silent around him. He stared at the documents for several moments, then reached for his phone, opened a travel application, selected a destination, Washington, D.C. His finger hovered briefly over the confirmation button, then pressed it. A few seconds later, a notification appeared. Flight booked. Henry looked at the screen, then at the files, then back at the screen. For the first time since beginning the review, he knew exactly what he needed to do. And somewhere in Washington, neither Aaliyah nor Eric had any idea that a plane ticket had just been purchased. A simple decision, a simple flight, a simple journey, one that would soon change everything. The evening Henry arrived in Washington, neither Eric nor Aaliyah knew he was already in the city. Neither knew he had spent months reviewing records. Neither knew he carried information capable of changing how people viewed the last several years. Life often works that way. The most important moments frequently begin long before anyone realizes they have started. 3 weeks after Henry's arrival, Washington prepared for one of the most prestigious nonprofit recognition events of the year, the National Community Impact Leadership Awards. The event attracted attention from across the country. Major donors attended, community leaders attended, journalists attended, national organizations sent representatives. For nonprofit executives, receiving recognition at the ceremony could open doors for years, and this year one name appeared at the center of nearly every conversation: Eric Thompson. His nomination had generated significant interest. Many people expected him to win. Some even treated the outcome as a foregone conclusion. After all, his organization had become one of the most visible educational initiatives in Washington. His interviews appeared regularly. His speaking engagements continued growing. His reputation seemed stronger than ever. The week leading up to the ceremony felt like a victory lap. Phone calls arrived constantly. Messages filled his inbox. Supporters offered congratulations before the event had even happened. One afternoon, Eric stood in front of a mirror adjusting a suit jacket while preparing for another interview. He looked confident, comfortable, accomplished. The reflection staring back at him represented years of work, years of sacrifice, years of ambition. And now the recognition seemed ready to arrive. The interviewer eventually asked a question he had heard many times. "What does this nomination mean to you?" Eric smiled. The answer came naturally. "It means the mission is being recognized." Technically, the statement wasn't wrong, yet something about it felt incomplete. Even Eric sensed it, for a brief moment. Then the interview moved on. The moment disappeared. By the end of the week, preparations for the award ceremony were complete. The speech had been written, the schedule confirmed, the invitations accepted. Everything appeared perfectly arranged. Meanwhile, across the city, Aaliyah's week looked very different. She wasn't preparing for an award, she wasn't expecting recognition, she wasn't planning a speech. In fact, she had no intention of attending the ceremony at all. The invitation sat untouched for days, then nearly a week, then longer. Each time she looked at it, the same question returned. Why go? The event represented a chapter of life she was trying to move beyond, a chapter filled with disappointment, public misunderstandings, painful memories. Part of her wanted nothing to do with it. Then a phone call changed her mind. Several former students would be recognized during the evening. Students she had mentored. Students whose accomplishments deserved celebration. That information complicated things, because refusing to attend might protect her feelings. But it would also mean missing an opportunity to support people she genuinely cared about. The decision took less than 30 seconds after that. She would go. Not for Eric, not for the award, not for the organization, for the students. Only the students. On the afternoon of the ceremony, Aaliyah stood in front of her bedroom mirror. The apartment remained modest, smaller than the home she once shared with Eric, yet it felt comfortable now. Familiar. A reflection of the life she had rebuilt. She adjusted her earrings, looked at herself, then laughed softly. Not from nervousness, from disbelief. Life had changed dramatically in a relatively short period of time. If someone had described her future a few years earlier, she never would have believed it. The laughter faded. A thoughtful expression replaced it. Then she picked up her purse and headed for the door. Across Washington, Eric's evening had already begun. The hotel hosting the ceremony sparkled beneath carefully arranged lighting. Guests arrived steadily. Luxury vehicles pulled toward the entrance. Photographers moved through designated areas. Staff members coordinated final preparations. The atmosphere carried excitement. Inside a private lounge, Eric adjusted his tie one final time. The room contained several other nominees. Most appeared nervous. Eric didn't. Not particularly. Years of public appearances had taught him how to remain composed. One nominee paced near a window. Another repeatedly checked a phone. Eric sat comfortably in a chair reviewing notes he probably wouldn't need. A volunteer entered the room. "We begin in 30 minutes. Several nominees nodded. Eric smiled. Everything felt exactly as it should. Meanwhile, Aaliyah entered through a different entrance. No photographers approached her. No reporters recognized her. No volunteers escorted her toward special seating. And honestly, she preferred it that way. The attention felt unnecessary. She quietly collected her event materials and entered the ballroom. The room looked spectacular. Large crystal chandeliers hung overhead. Elegant centerpieces decorated every table. Conversations echoed throughout the space. Hundreds of guests filled the venue. Aaliyah paused briefly near the entrance, taking everything in. Then she located her assigned seat. Near the back, far from the spotlight, perfect. She sat down and looked around. The years had changed many things, yet some realities remained surprisingly familiar. The same types of conversations, the same networking circles, the same public enthusiasm. Aaliyah smiled politely and settled into her chair. Her focus remained simple. Celebrate the students, leave afterward, nothing more. Across the ballroom, Eric eventually entered with several event organizers. People greeted him immediately. Handshakes, smiles, congratulations. The reaction resembled what he had experienced for months, only larger, more visible, more intense. At one point, while moving through the crowd, Eric glanced toward the seating area. His eyes landed on Aaliyah. The sight surprised him. Not because she wasn't invited, because he genuinely hadn't expected her to come. For a brief moment, he watched her from across the room. She appeared calm, composed, focused on something entirely separate from the event's main attraction. Their eyes met briefly. Then Aaliyah looked away. The interaction lasted only seconds, yet both felt it, a reminder of everything that once existed, a reminder of everything that no longer did. The ceremony was minutes away from beginning. Neither knew that another guest had already entered the building. Neither knew he carried a leather portfolio. Neither knew he had spent months preparing for this evening. And neither knew that before the night ended, the story everyone believed would be challenged in front of the entire room. Because while Eric and Aaliyah had arrived for completely different reasons, someone else had arrived carrying the truth. The ceremony began exactly the way everyone expected. Elegant, organized, predictable. Soft music filled the ballroom as guests settled into their seats. Servers quietly moved between tables collecting final drink orders. Conversations gradually faded. Attention shifted toward the stage. The evening's program appeared straightforward. Awards, recognition, speeches, applause. The kind of event Washington hosted every year. The kind of event people attended, enjoyed, and forgot a few weeks later. At least that was the expectation. Aaliyah sat quietly near the back of the ballroom. Her attention remained focused on the student recognitions scheduled later in the evening. Nothing else mattered, not Eric, not the award, not the attention surrounding him. Those chapters belonged to the past. Or at least she wanted to believe they did. Across the room, Eric appeared completely comfortable. The confidence surrounding him had grown noticeably over the years. He moved naturally through conversations, accepted congratulations graciously, laughed when appropriate, answered questions easily. Several guests approached him before the ceremony officially began. Each interaction reinforced the same message. People expected him to win. Some practically spoke as if the decision had already been made. One donor shook his hand. "You've earned this." Another smiled. "Tonight should be special." A third simply said, "Congratulations in advance." Eric thanked them politely, yet inside he enjoyed every second. After years of building his reputation, moments like this felt rewarding. The room seemed to confirm everything he believed about his journey, everything he believed about his success, everything he believed about his legacy. The lights dimmed slightly. The host stepped onto the stage. Applause spread through the ballroom. The evening officially began. For nearly an hour, everything unfolded normally. Awards were presented. Recipients gave speeches. Guests applauded. Photographers captured smiling faces. Nothing unusual happened. Then the ballroom doors opened, quietly. So quietly that most people never looked up. A man entered carrying a leather portfolio. His arrival lacked drama. No announcement, no escort, no attention. He simply walked inside. Calm, focused, purposeful. Most guests ignored him. Why wouldn't they? The room was filled with important people. One more attendee hardly seemed worth noticing. The man moved carefully between tables. His pace remained steady. His expression remained composed. Several people glanced in his direction briefly, then returned their attention to the stage. Only one person continued watching. Aaliyah. At first, she wasn't sure why. Something felt familiar. The way he carried himself. The way he moved through the room without appearing intimidated by it. A strange feeling settled in her chest. She leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better look. The man continued walking, then he turned his head. Aaliyah froze. For a second she questioned herself. Years had passed. People changed, faces matured, lives evolved. Yet recognition arrived instantly. Henry Brooks. The same teenager who once sat quietly in the community center. The same teenager who barely believed in himself. The same teenager she spent months encouraging. Only now, he wasn't a teenager anymore. He looked confident, accomplished, professional. Aaliyah couldn't stop staring. What was he doing here? The question repeated itself immediately. She knew Henry's character. He wasn't the type to attend events simply for appearances. If he was here, there was a reason, a very specific reason. Across the ballroom, Eric remained completely unaware. He never looked toward the entrance, never noticed Henry, never noticed Aaliyah watching him. The ceremony continued. The host returned to the stage. Several awards remained, including the biggest award of the evening, the National Community Impact Leadership Award. The anticipation inside the room became noticeable. Guests adjusted in their seats. Conversations stopped. People prepared for the ceremony's final major moment. Eric straightened slightly, his attention fixed on the stage. The host smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen." The room grew quiet. "We've reached the final portion of tonight's program." Applause followed, then faded. The host glanced toward a note card. Everything still appeared normal. Then something changed, subtle at first. The host's expression became more serious. The room sensed it immediately. The energy shifted, not dramatically, just enough to make people pay closer attention. The host cleared his throat. "Before we present our final award this evening." A brief pause followed. Several audience members exchanged curious looks. The sentence felt unexpected. The host continued. "We've been asked to include an additional presentation." The ballroom became noticeably quieter. Eric frowned. Only slightly. Nothing in the official schedule mentioned an additional presentation. Aaliyah sat completely still. Her eyes moved toward Henry, who remained seated near the side of the room. The host continued reading. "This presentation concerns findings from a recently completed independent review involving several educational initiatives associated with one of tonight's featured organizations." Now people were paying attention, really paying attention. Guests looked at one another. Whispers began forming. Questions appeared immediately. What review? Why now? What findings? Eric felt the first genuine discomfort of the evening. Not fear, not yet. Just uncertainty. The kind that appears when events stop following the expected script. His confidence remained intact, but curiosity replaced certainty. The host looked toward the side of the ballroom. To present those findings, please welcome attorney Henry Brooks. Silence. Not complete silence, but close. Many guests looked confused. The name meant nothing to them. Others searched their programs. Several journalists immediately reached for notebooks. Aaliyah felt her heartbeat quicken. Because now she understood. At least partially. Henry wasn't attending as a guest. He wasn't attending as a former student. He wasn't attending to celebrate. He was here for a purpose serious enough to alter the event schedule itself. Henry stood. The leather portfolio remained in his hand. The ballroom watched as he walked toward the stage, measured, calm, unhurried. The confidence in his posture commanded attention without demanding it. Each step seemed to increase the tension inside the room. Guests stopped whispering. Journalists focused completely. Donors leaned forward. Even the staff appeared uncertain. Eric's eyes followed Henry now, studying him, trying to understand who he was, trying to understand why he had suddenly become the most important person in the ballroom. Henry reached the stage, shook the host's hand, walked toward the podium, then placed the portfolio carefully beside him. No smile, no performance, no attempt to entertain the audience, only purpose. The room became completely still. Hundreds of people watched, waiting, wondering, speculating. Aaliyah barely moved. Eric sat frozen. Henry adjusted the microphone, opened the portfolio, removed several documents, then looked across the ballroom. The silence felt heavy now, different from before, charged, anticipatory. The kind of silence that appears moments before everything changes. Henry finally spoke. Good evening. His voice carried clearly throughout the room, calm, professional, controlled. He looked down briefly at the documents, then back toward the audience. Over the past several months I have conducted an independent review involving educational initiatives connected to this organization. Every eye remained fixed on him. No distractions, no side conversations, no movement. The tension inside the ballroom had become impossible to ignore, and for the first time all evening, Eric Thompson no longer felt certain about what was coming next. The ballroom remained silent. Hundreds of people sat motionless, waiting, watching, trying to understand why an independent review had suddenly become part of the evening's program. Henry stood behind the podium, calm, composed. The same steady confidence Aaliyah remembered from the young man who eventually learned to believe in himself. Only now there was something more. Authority. The kind earned through experience. The kind that made people listen. Henry glanced across the room. His eyes briefly met Aaliyah's. A small nod followed. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Yet Aaliyah immediately understood. This wasn't personal, this wasn't revenge. Henry was there because he believed something important needed to be corrected. He looked back toward the audience, then began. Over the past several months, my review examined grant applications, program development records, internal communications, planning documents, organizational reports, and historical leadership contributions connected to several educational initiatives. The room listened carefully. Henry continued. The purpose of the review was simple. He paused. To accurately document how these programs were created, developed, and expanded. Writing. Others opened laptops. Across the ballroom, Eric sat completely still. His expression remained controlled, but inside, uncertainty was growing. The evening had already moved far beyond anything he expected. Henry opened the first folder, removed several documents, then placed them on a screen behind him. The audience turned toward the large display. Rows of information appeared, program proposals, development timelines, planning records, dates, names, signatures, nothing sensational, nothing emotional, just facts. Henry pointed toward the screen. This proposal helped launch one of the organization's most successful mentorship initiatives. Several audience members nodded. Many recognized the program immediately. The initiative had received national attention. It had become one of the nonprofit's biggest achievements. Henry continued. The original development records identify the primary architect of the initiative. The audience waited. Henry pressed a button. A name appeared clearly on the screen. Aaliyah Carter. The room reacted immediately. Not loudly, but noticeably. People shifted in their seats. Whispers appeared. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Aaliyah felt her stomach tighten. Eric's jaw hardened. Henry remained focused. He wasn't finished. Not even close. A second document appeared, then a third, then a fourth, each connected to major organizational achievements, each connected to programs widely associated with Eric. Each showed extensive involvement from Aaliyah. Planning, research, implementation, leadership. The evidence continued building, piece by piece, document by document. The audience watched carefully. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged him. Because every statement came with proof. And proof has a way of silencing arguments before they begin. Henry opened another folder. This grant application secured one of the largest early funding packages received by the organization. The audience focused on the screen again. The document appeared. Several highlighted sections became visible: research, strategic planning, program development, all attributed to the same person, Aaliyah. More whispers, more confusion, more surprise. Eric shifted slightly in his chair. For the first time all evening, discomfort became visible, not dramatic, but visible. Because the information being presented wasn't vague. It wasn't based on opinion. It wasn't based on interpretation. It was based on records. Henry continued. The review also examined internal communication spanning multiple years. He opened another file. Emails appeared on the screen. Conversations, planning discussions, program drafts, strategic recommendations. The audience watched as timeline after timeline revealed the same pattern. Aaliyah's involvement wasn't occasional, it wasn't minor, it wasn't supportive, it was foundational. Several board members looked stunned, others appeared deeply uncomfortable. One donor lowered his glasses and stared at the screen, as if hoping the information might somehow change. It didn't. Henry moved forward methodically, no exaggeration, no emotional language, just facts, a calm presentation of reality. And reality was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. A journalist near the front row began flipping through previous notes. Another reviewed older articles. Connections formed quickly, questions followed immediately. How had this been overlooked? How had so many contributions disappeared from public understanding? How had the narrative become so different from the records? The ballroom's energy transformed completely. The award ceremony no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a revelation. Henry displayed another series of documents. These focused on organizational growth strategies. Several guests recognized them instantly. The plans had played a major role in expanding educational programs throughout Washington. Again, the same name appeared. Aaliyah Carter. Again, and again, and again. Not because Henry was forcing a conclusion, because the records kept leading back to her. Every path seemed to arrive at the same place. The audience began realizing something uncomfortable. The story they believed might not be the complete story. Across the room, Aaliyah remained frozen. Not from satisfaction, not from vindication, from disbelief. For so long she had accepted that the truth might never fully surface. For so long she had watched people misunderstand her role. For so long she had carried the weight of being forgotten. Now, in front of hundreds of people, the facts were speaking for themselves. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't planned it, hadn't orchestrated it. Yet here it was. The truth, finally standing on its own. Henry reached the final section of documents, the most comprehensive records of all. Years of planning, years of development, years of organizational growth. The audience studied them carefully, no longer skeptical, no longer confused. Now they were processing, re-evaluating, reconsidering. The implications became impossible to avoid. Aaliyah had not played a minor role. She had played a major one. Perhaps one of the most important roles. The realization moved through the ballroom like a wave. Slow at first, then impossible to stop. People looked toward Aaliyah, some with surprise, others with respect, several with regret, because many were realizing they had accepted an incomplete version of events, and now they were seeing the full picture. Henry stepped away from the screen briefly. The ballroom remained completely silent, then he spoke again. This review does not diminish anyone else's contributions. His voice remained calm, professional, measured. It simply recognizes contributions that history failed to acknowledge properly. The statement carried weight. Because it wasn't an attack. It wasn't an accusation. It was a correction supported by evidence. And evidence is difficult to argue with. Across the room, Eric stared toward the stage. The confidence that filled him earlier in the evening had disappeared. Not because someone attacked him, Because facts had entered the conversation, and facts don't negotiate. For years, public perception had worked in his favor. Tonight that perception was beginning to change, slowly, publicly, irreversibly. The room no longer viewed him exactly the same way. Not because they hated him, because they were seeing more of the story, and the more they saw, the more questions appeared, questions Eric could feel forming around him, questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Aaliyah remained seated, quiet, emotional, overwhelmed. The attention made her uncomfortable, yet she couldn't deny what was happening. The truth she stopped expecting was finally finding its voice, and for the first time in years, people were listening. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Do you believe truth always finds its way out? Maybe not immediately, maybe not when people want it to, maybe not before damage has been done. But eventually? What do you think? Tell us in the comments below. Because inside that ballroom, hundreds of people were beginning to learn a lesson they would never forget. The truth may arrive late, but when it arrives carrying evidence, it can change everything. And Henry Brooks wasn't finished speaking yet. The ballroom remained silent after Henry's final statement. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of realization. People were thinking, processing, reconsidering everything they believed about the story they had been told. Henry allowed the silence to settle. He didn't rush, he didn't immediately continue. Because some moments deserve room to breathe. Across the ballroom, journalists sat motionless. Board members stared toward the stage. Donors exchanged uncertain looks. And Aaliyah remained frozen in her chair. For years she had carried the weight of being overlooked. Now suddenly hundreds of people were looking directly at her. The attention felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable, overwhelming. Henry reached for the glass of water beside the podium, took a small sip, then set it down. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different, less formal, more personal. The documents matter. His eyes moved across the room. The records matter. A few people nodded. Henry continued. But numbers don't tell the entire story. The audience listened carefully. Spreadsheets don't explain character. The room remained still. Reports don't explain compassion. A pause followed. Documents don't explain what happens when someone refuses to give up on a person everyone else has already forgotten. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The conversation was no longer about organizational credit. Now it was about something deeper, something human. Henry looked down briefly, as if collecting his thoughts, then looked back up. Before speaking, his eyes found Aaliyah. For a second neither moved. Then Henry smiled, a small smile. Respectful, grateful, the smile of someone remembering where he came from. Before I became an attorney, his voice carried clearly throughout the ballroom. Before I graduated from college, another pause. Before anyone invited me to stand at a podium like this. The audience remained completely focused. I was a teenager who had almost stopped believing in himself. Aaliyah lowered her eyes, because she knew exactly where this was going, and suddenly she wasn't sure she was emotionally prepared for it. Henry continued, I wasn't failing because I lacked ability. The room listened. I was failing because I had stopped believing effort mattered. Several audience members shifted in their seats. The honesty carried weight. When enough doors close, people stop knocking. The statement landed heavily, because many understood exactly what he meant. Henry nodded slowly. As a teenager, I convinced myself my future was already decided. He smiled faintly. And it wasn't a very good future. A few people laughed softly. The humor helped, briefly. Then Henry continued. I showed up at a community program mostly because someone convinced me I had nothing to lose. His eyes moved toward Aaliyah again. What I found there changed my life. Aaliyah swallowed hard. The ballroom remained silent. Henry stepped away from the podium slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to make the story feel more personal. Most people saw my grades, he paused. They saw my attitude. Another pause. They saw my problems. The room remained still, but one person looked past all of that. Aaliyah closed her eyes briefly. The emotion was becoming difficult to hide. Henry's voice softened. She asked questions nobody else asked. The audience listened carefully. She listened when nobody else had time. Another pause. She stayed when leaving would have been easier. The ballroom had become completely absorbed, because everyone understood something important now. This wasn't about organizational leadership. This wasn't about awards. This wasn't about public recognition. This was about one human being changing another human being's life. Henry looked toward the audience. When I missed meetings, A faint smile appeared. She called. Several people smiled. When I doubted myself. His smile faded. She didn't. Aaliyah looked down at her hands. Tears were already forming. Henry continued. When I wanted to quit. The room waited. She refused to let me. The emotion inside the ballroom became impossible to ignore. Several guests wiped their eyes. Others looked away briefly, trying to compose themselves, trying to hide reactions. Some weren't successful. Henry took a slow breath, then shared the part of the story nobody expected. There was a period when I stopped showing up completely. The audience listened carefully, stopped answering calls. A pause. Stopped responding to emails. Another pause. Stopped believing anything would improve. The room remained silent. Henry smiled softly, and she kept checking anyway. Aaliyah finally wiped away a tear. She remembered every bit of it. The missed meetings, the unanswered messages, the concern, the determination. At the time, she never imagined those moments would matter years later. Yet here they were, standing in front of hundreds of people, still alive, still meaningful. Henry's voice remained steady. I used to think success came from talent. He looked around the room. Now I know success often begins with somebody believing in you before you've earned it. The statement hit hard, because everyone could relate to it. Everyone could remember a teacher, a mentor, a coach, a family member, someone who believed first. The ballroom had become emotional, deeply emotional. Henry wasn't presenting evidence anymore. He was presenting impact, and impact speaks a language everyone understands. He looked toward Aaliyah once more, then said something that made the room even quieter. I am standing here tonight because Aaliyah Carter never gave up on me. No one moved, no one spoke. The sentence settled over the ballroom, simple, direct, powerful, and completely sincere. For several seconds, silence filled the room. Then movement appeared. Small at first, near the back. A chair moved. Someone stood. The sound drew attention immediately. Then another chair moved. Another person stood. Then another, and another. Aaliyah looked up, confused, emotional, unprepared. Her eyes widened. Because she recognized them. Former students. One by one. People whose lives crossed her path years earlier. People she mentored, encouraged, supported. People she hadn't expected to see. People now rising to their feet. Not because anyone asked them to, because they wanted to. And suddenly it became clear. Henry wasn't the only life she changed. He was simply the first person willing to tell the story. And the ballroom was about to discover just how many others were ready to speak. The ballroom remained frozen. Nobody seemed completely sure what was happening anymore. The awards ceremony had transformed into something else, something far more powerful. The former students who had risen to their feet remained standing. Some smiled, some wiped away tears. Others simply looked toward Aaliyah with quiet gratitude. The room watched them, trying to understand, trying to connect the stories, trying to grasp the full impact of what Henry had revealed. Henry stepped away from the podium. For the first time all evening, he wasn't the center of attention. The people standing behind him were, because they represented something no document could fully capture. Lives changed, futures redirected, dreams restored. Aaliyah sat motionless, her hands trembled slightly. The attention felt overwhelming. For years she had become accustomed to being overlooked, invisible, forgotten. Now hundreds of people were looking at her, not because of a title, not because of an award, because of the difference she had made. Henry spoke again. His voice remained calm. Several people asked if they could attend tonight. Aaliyah looked toward him, confused. She hadn't known, hadn't expected any of this. Henry smiled softly. I think they would like to say something. The ballroom remained silent. Then one of the former students stepped forward. A woman, confident, professional. She approached the stage slowly. The audience followed her every movement. She stopped beside Henry, looked toward Aaliyah, then smiled. The smile carried years of gratitude. I teach third grade now. The room listened carefully. The woman laughed softly. Honestly, there was a time nobody thought I'd even finish high school. Several people smiled. Others nodded knowingly. The woman continued. I struggled. A brief pause. I struggled a lot. The honesty felt refreshing, real, human. No matter how frustrated I became. She looked directly at Aaliyah. You never treated me like a lost cause. Aaliyah immediately lowered her head. The emotion hit hard. The teacher continued, "You helped me understand that one bad season doesn't define an entire life." Several audience members wiped away tears. The woman smiled. "Now I spend every day telling children the exact same thing." Applause filled the ballroom. Not loud, not explosive, meaningful. The teacher stepped aside. Another former student approached. A man this time, confident, composed, wearing medical scrubs beneath a jacket. The audience immediately understood. A nurse. He stopped near the microphone, then laughed nervously. "I wasn't planning to speak." The audience laughed gently with him. "Actually, I was hoping Henry wouldn't call on me." More laughter. The tension eased slightly. Then his expression softened. "When I was 16, I failed 2 classes when the room listened. By 17, I thought my future was finished." He shook his head, looking back on the memory. "I didn't need somebody to lecture me." A pause followed. "I needed somebody to believe I could do better." His eyes moved toward Aaliyah. That's exactly what she did. The room became emotional again. The nurse continued, "I work 12-hour shifts now." He smiled. "Some days longer." Several people laughed. "But every patient I help exists because someone helped me first." Aaliyah pressed a hand against her mouth, trying to hold herself together, trying not to cry openly. The nurse stepped away. The applause grew louder. The audience no longer needed convincing. They were beginning to understand. Then another former student approached, an engineer. He carried himself differently, more reserved, more analytical. Yet his emotion was obvious. "I like facts." The audience smiled. "So I appreciated Henry's presentation." A few laughs followed. The engineer adjusted the microphone, then continued, "Here's a fact." The room listened. If Aaliyah hadn't intervened when she did, I would have dropped out. Silence followed. The statement landed heavily. He nodded. "That's not speculation." Another pause. "That's what was going to happen." The engineer smiled toward Aaliyah. "You convinced me to stay." His voice softened. "One conversation changed the entire direction of my life." The rumor may I design infrastructure projects across the country. Several audience members applauded immediately. The engineer shook his head. "No." His eyes moved toward Aaliyah. "Applaud her." The room erupted again, stronger this time, longer, more emotional. Aaliyah wiped away another tear. She wasn't trying anymore. The emotions were simply too large. Then came the final testimony. A military officer, tall, disciplined, composed. He approached the microphone with quiet confidence. The ballroom settled immediately. He stood for a moment before speaking, almost as though choosing his words carefully. Then he looked directly at Aaliyah and smiled. "I don't know if you remember this." Aaliyah laughed through tears. "I probably do." The audience laughed softly. The officer nodded. "You once told me that discipline means doing the right thing when nobody is watching." Aaliyah froze. She remembered, perfectly. The officer continued. "I carried those words through military training." The room listened carefully. "I carried them during deployments." A pause. "I still carry them today." The ballroom became silent again. The officer's voice remained steady. "But that's not why I'm standing here." He looked around the room, then back toward Aaliyah. "I'm standing here because leadership isn't about standing in front." The statement carried weight, especially now, especially here. It's about lifting other people. The officer nodded toward Aaliyah. That's what she did. No applause followed immediately. The audience simply sat there, feeling it, absorbing it, understanding it. Then something remarkable happened. A guest near the front stood. No announcement, no invitation, just stood. Then another, then another, then another. The movement spread throughout the ballroom. Table after table, row after row. People rose to their feet. Board members, journalists, donors, volunteers, community leaders. Everyone, a standing ovation. Not for an award, not for a title, not for public recognition, for impact, for integrity, for years of unseen work. The applause filled the ballroom. Louder than anything heard all evening, stronger than any previous recognition. Aaliyah stared around the room in disbelief. The emotion overwhelmed her completely. Tears streamed freely now. She didn't care, couldn't care. For years she had accepted that her contributions might never be fully understood. Now an entire ballroom was standing because of those contributions. The moment felt impossible, beautiful, painful, healing, all at once. Across the room, Eric remained seated. Not because he refused to stand, because he couldn't move. The reality of everything finally settled over him, the documents, the testimonies, the former students, the standing ovation. For the first time in years he saw the complete picture. Not the public version, not the simplified version. The truth. The woman sitting across the ballroom had changed lives, dozens of lives, maybe hundreds. And while he had spent years pursuing recognition, she had spent those same years building significance. The distinction suddenly felt enormous, painfully enormous. Eric slowly rose to his feet. Not for appearances, not because everyone else was doing it, because anything less would be dishonest. His hands joined the applause. The sound felt different now, not celebratory. Reflective. Regretful. And as the standing ovation continued around him, Eric Thompson faced something he had avoided for years. The truth wasn't just changing how the audience viewed Aaliyah, it was changing how he viewed himself. And for the first time all evening, that realization hurt more than anything Henry had presented. The standing ovation continued for nearly a full minute, then another. People weren't rushing back into their seats. They weren't checking phones. They weren't thinking about the award anymore. Something bigger had happened. The evening had stopped being about recognition. It had become about truth. Eventually the applause began fading. Guests slowly returned to their seats. Some wiped away tears, others sat quietly reflecting. The atmosphere inside the ballroom felt completely different from the beginning of the night. At the start, everyone arrived expecting a celebration. Now they had witnessed a reckoning. Henry returned to the podium one final time. The room settled immediately. No one wanted to miss a word. Not now. Not after everything they had seen. Henry looked across the ballroom. His voice remained calm, professional, measured. The purpose of this review was never punishment. Several people nodded. It was accuracy. He paused. Because people deserve to be remembered honestly. The statement settled over the room. Nobody disagreed. Nobody could. Henry thanked the audience, thanked the review committee, thanked the former students, then stepped away from the microphone. His role was finished. The facts had spoken. The lives had spoken. Now the consequences belonged to everyone else. Several members of the awards committee gathered near the stage. Conversations began immediately. Serious conversations. Necessary conversations. The type that couldn't be postponed. The type that couldn't be ignored. The audience watched quietly. Minutes passed. The atmosphere remained tense. Then the host returned. Gone was the cheerful energy from earlier. What remained was professionalism, respect, responsibility. The host took a breath, then addressed the room. After reviewing the information presented this evening and consulting with the committee, the ballroom became completely silent. The National Community Impact Leadership Award will not be presented tonight. A ripple moved through the audience. Not shock, understanding. The host continued. The committee believes additional review is necessary before any final determination can be made. No applause followed. No celebration, only acceptance. The decision felt unavoidable. The evening's events had changed everything. Across the room, Eric sat quietly. The announcement landed heavily. Not because he lost the award, because he finally understood why. For years he convinced himself that recognition reflected the entire story. Tonight proved otherwise. A person's public image can grow large enough to hide uncomfortable truths, but eventually those truths demand space. And when they do, reality has a way of catching up. Eric looked toward Aaliyah. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't enjoying his discomfort. That realization hurt even more, because despite everything that happened between them, she still wasn't the person he had convinced himself she had become. The room slowly emptied. Guests departed. Journalists gathered notes. Committee members continued discussions. The ceremony ended, not with triumph, with reflection. Outside, Washington's night air felt cooler than before. Aaliyah stood near the entrance holding her purse. The evening still felt unreal. Part of her wondered whether she would wake up tomorrow and discover none of it happened. Footsteps approached. She turned. Henry. For a second, neither spoke. Then Aaliyah shook her head, still trying to process everything. You planned all this. Henry laughed. A little. A little? He smiled. Okay. More than a little. For the first time that night, Aaliyah laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes from relief. The kind that comes from gratitude. Then her expression softened. Thank you. Henry immediately shook his head. No. His answer came quickly, too quickly. You already thanked yourself years ago. Aaliyah frowned. What does that mean? Henry smiled. It means I wouldn't be standing here if you hadn't shown up when nobody else did. The emotion returned immediately. Aaliyah looked away briefly, trying to keep herself together. Henry understood. He changed the subject, a skill she remembered from years earlier. The conversation lasted another 20 minutes. Then they said goodbye. Neither realized that evening marked the beginning of another chapter. Not the end, the beginning. Months passed, spring arrived, Washington slowly emerged from winter. Trees regained color, parks filled with families, community events returned outdoors, life moved forward. The awards controversy remained a topic of discussion for a while. Several publications updated previous reporting. Organizational records were corrected. Public understanding slowly changed, not overnight, but steadily. Truth often works that way. Slow, persistent, difficult to stop. Meanwhile, Aaliyah focused on something far more important, the future. One afternoon she stood outside a newly renovated building in southeast Washington. The location wasn't glamorous. The paint was fresh, the windows were clean, the sign above the entrance was simple. Yet the sight filled her with pride. A new mentorship center. A place dedicated to helping young people find direction, opportunity, and support. Exactly the type of work she loved most. Volunteers moved through the building carrying supplies. Tables were arranged, books filled shelves, computers lined a learning space. Excitement filled every corner. The opening day had finally arrived. Aaliyah stood near the entrance greeting families as they arrived. Teenagers entered cautiously. Parents asked questions. Children explored every room. The energy felt familiar, hopeful, alive. Aaliyah smiled more that day than she had in years. Then another familiar face appeared. Henry. He walked toward the building carrying a box of donated materials. Aaliyah laughed. You're late. Henry looked offended. I am exactly 3 minutes early. According to who? According to me. Aaliyah laughed again. The exchange felt effortless, natural, the way strong partnerships often feel. Months earlier, Henry had approached her with an idea. Why not build something new? Why not create a place focused entirely on young people? Why not continue the mission? Together. The answer had been obvious. And now here they were, partners. Not because of obligation, because they shared the same purpose. Throughout the afternoon, young people continued arriving. Some nervous, some excited, some carrying the same uncertainty Henry once carried years ago. Aaliyah recognized it immediately. The hesitation, the doubt, the questions they didn't know how to ask. She also recognized something else. Potential. The same potential she saw in Henry. The same potential she had spent years helping others discover. A teenage boy paused near the entrance, clearly unsure whether he belonged. Aaliyah smiled, then walked over. First day? The teenager nodded. Aaliyah smiled again. Good. The teenager looked confused. Why is that good? Aaliyah laughed softly. Because everybody starts somewhere. The teenager smiled. The tension disappeared. Just like that. A small moment. An important moment. The kind that changes lives long before anyone realizes it. Across the room Henry watched, then smiled. Because he had seen that moment before. Years ago. In a community center. When someone decided he was worth believing in. The afternoon continued. Families filled the building. Volunteers worked tirelessly. Conversations happened. Friendships formed. Opportunities appeared. And standing in the center of it all, Aaliyah felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. Not because life had been easy. Not because every wound had healed. Not because every mistake had been corrected. Because purpose had survived. And purpose is difficult to destroy. As the sun began setting outside, laughter echoed through the building. Young people filled classrooms, mentors shared advice, hope occupied every corner. The mission continued, stronger than before, not because one person received an award, because people kept showing up, helping, teaching, believing. Before we close today's story, let me ask you for one final favor. If this story touched you, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that integrity still matters. Because stories like this deserve to be heard. And remember this, recognition comes from attention, significance comes from contribution. The world may forget who received the applause, but it never forgets who changed lives. And long after the awards were forgotten, long after the headlines disappeared, long after the speeches faded, the lives Aaliyah changed continued moving forward. One student, one opportunity, one act of belief at a time. because in the end, that was the real legacy.